Good morning and welcome to this video on crime and punishment as I understand it. We're going to be breaking down what crime is, why we punish it, what that punishment can look like, and maybe a better way to go around the whole thing. I'm not sure anybody actually understands what justice is. Certainly the people that care about it the most probably don't. And this is something that shouldn't really come as a shock to anybody, because justice is just fairness writ large. And you can ask anybody that works with children and they will tell you that fairness is just a nice word we made up to shut people up. It just means whatever it is that the person talking wants to promote. So let's shelve the whole idea of justice being this natural and inalienable thing, and instead have a look at what we would want justice to be. And you might want to start with something along the lines of justice is how we deal with people who break the law. But when you think about it, this is actually pretty circular, because justice and the law are more or less the same thing, but you just hope one of them's written down. So let's instead go with the law is the series of rules which we follow so that everybody can have as much liberty as possible without restricting anybody else's liberty. And if you've been paying attention to my other videos, then you may start thinking, hang on a second, this feels a lot like human rights. And you'd be right, because it turns out that criminal justice is how governments protect people's human rights from each other. So if we believe that, then that means that all of our crimes are going to be abstractions of violations of human rights. So if we think that people have a right to property, then that means theft has to be a crime. If we think people have a right to good health, then that means violence has to be a crime. And if we think that people have a right to a functioning justice system, then that means disrespecting the courts has to be a crime. Okay, so we know why we want a criminal justice system, so now all we have to do is skip over the whole bit where we come up with loads of good laws that everybody can agree with that will be necessary and helpful, and get on to what do we do with people who break those laws. Where I'm going to go with this, I'm going to say that there are 3 ways that you deal with criminals: punishment, quarantine, and rehabilitation. So let's break those all down in order. So punishment is going to be your first instinct when you think of what to do with a criminal. And punishment is this weird thing where it's very much the whole blindfold and scales image of Lady Justice, where every time a crime is committed, there's a balance that's suddenly out of whack, and there's something that you can do that is going to redress that balance, that somehow the criminal justice system is going to know what that thing is to make it so that it's levelled out. The problem here is that, as Ben Kingsley's Mohandas Gandhi told us, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. We have a natural instinct for revenge, and that instinct is at best fruitless and at worst actively harmful to our own interests. It's an impossible problem because we're never going to be able to say this is the rational way to counteract that crime having happened. If somebody is found guilty of murder, will killing them redress that balance? Do we need to do something more than kill them? Does there need to be more suffering? Because murder doesn't just affect the person that died, but also causes emotional distress for their friends and their families. What if it is a doctor who killed a homeless person? Well, now we have somebody who is far more useful to society and somebody with no value to society. So does that mean that now we no longer need to kill the murderer, because that would be overbalancing the whole situation? And not being able to answer these questions in any satisfactory way is why we will end up with conflicts constantly escalating. It's why you will always see the justice system disproportionately working on some sectors of society and not on others. And there's also a prophylactic quality to punishment as well, whereby the existence of the punishment will in theory mean that people will not do the crime. And it can be hard to argue that that doesn't work. When you look at somewhere like Singapore, which has very strict punishments, then the crime rate does go down. But the problem with doing a Singapore is that you have to have no leeway. You can have no wiggle room, you can have no mitigating circumstances. And the reason for this is human nature. As soon as somebody thinks that they will be able to get out of something, either because of luck or because of ingenuity, then they will go for it, because humanity loves a chancer. And if we pile on top of that the possibility that some of your laws will be ones that not everybody agrees with, then you now have to be not just strict with the law, but probably go overboard with the law, so that nobody ever thinks that it's going to be worth breaking the law. So I'm going to declare punishment just a non-starter, which means we now have to move on to quarantine. Which is to say, we have people who are dangerous to society, and therefore we remove them from society so that they are no longer a danger to society. Your easiest version of this is murder that person. Murdered people are very bad at committing crimes. And this ties in really nicely to our whole punishment as a preventative measure thing, but has the exact same problem. On the one hand, you are going to have people who have been falsely accused and or convicted, and on the other, you're going to have sectors of society which are disproportionately targeted by the justice system, either because they are poor in some way and more likely to take the risks that those crimes would entail, or because they are a marginalised part of society which people are more likely to suspect and thus convict of crimes. So your next approach to quarantine would be prison. But prison is a pretty blanket approach for all crimes. Prison for tax evasion is much like trying to use a hammer to sort out a sinking souffle. That, and if somebody's a problem for society, then removing them from society doesn't stop them being problematic. So what you then have to do is pledge to hold on to that person forever and keep housing them. So maybe what you need is a more tailored approach, like how if somebody ends up in bankruptcy court, then they won't be able to run a company again. Or how people convicted of sex offences then aren't allowed to do certain jobs. But even here, we come up with another potential problem. And to talk about it, I'm going to need to go on a wee bit of a tangent. Why do we think that life is sacred? There are people who will tell you that even masturbation or abortion is a terrible thing, presumably because you are squandering potential lives. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum who will tell you that euthanasia is a terrible thing, for similar sorts of reasons. And if we follow those lines of reasoning, then the conclusion we have to reach is that the value of a life is in its potential to affect the world. And if that's true, then any of these quarantine methods will have the same effect of removing somebody's potential from the world. And if we believe that, then what we need to do is find a way to both prevent criminals from criming again, but also allow them to contribute to society in the future. And for that, we would need our third option, rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is what you would hope it would mean. You take somebody who is damaging to society and you make them less damaging to society. So our fundamental assumption here is that there is a problem with this person and this problem can be fixed. So your first pass at dealing with this is going to be something along the lines of, this person never learnt proper morals and therefore we are going to teach them proper morals. And your outcome of that should look something like, I have learnt the error of my ways and I will not do that bad thing again. And we now get to our first contradiction, our first objection, where if you rehabilitate somebody too quickly, then the punishment camp get really irked because this person has not suffered enough to redress the balance. So what you need to do is you need to rehabilitate people, but inefficiently. And on top of that, just rehabilitating the person is going to ignore the reasons why they potentially committed the crime in the first place. There's an interesting parallel here to be made with terrorism, where we know that the best way to deal with terrorists is with amnesty and reconciliation. But people do rather have a bloodlust for terrorists, and they will demand their pound of flesh. But I digress. A more progressive bent to rehabilitation would be something more along the lines of, this person has neither the skills nor the education to be of benefit to society, and thus we must give them the skills and the education to be of benefit to society. This is why The Shawshank Redemption was all about how to be a librarian, because books are where knowledge and skills are, and thus it is good for prisoners to have access to books. But then we have to wonder, well, why are we giving this education and these skills to criminals when we could instead be giving it to the homeless and to the impoverished? And what you're probably going to find is that, though that is a very reasonable argument to make, the answer is probably we should be giving it to all of them. So then your radical and progressive version of rehabilitation becomes, this person doesn't have money or security, and thus we are going to give them a permanent residence and enough money to be able to feed themselves so that they no longer need to commit crimes. I'm not sure anybody quite does this, and that swings us right back round to why the whole criminal justice system is problematic. Criminal justice is and always will be very much just putting out fires. It is saying that people have done something wrong without ever looking at why they did the wrong thing. And people will tell you that the whole preventative punishment idea is addressing the why, but it isn't addressing the why. It's giving you a reason not to do something without ever removing the reason to do something in the first place. There is this worrying realization that you will come to if you study the law enough, especially if you go into any sort of comparative law, that criminal laws only exist because they needed to. There are so many crimes on the books that would be unthinkable to a normal person, but they had to be put in there because either somebody did it or something came up that made it apparent that somebody might do it. Laws and the crimes associated with them come in a panoply of flavours, and the ways to prevent them are going to be just as varied and just as imaginative. There will not be a one-size-fits-all solution to any of this, and that in itself is going to be an issue for anybody trying to fix the problem within a democratic system. Because a democratic society is always going to want to see easily understandable results. As ever, I'm not saying that I have necessarily a solution to the problem of how to deal with criminal justice, but hopefully by breaking down the purported goals of the criminal justice system, we can see how those goals end up conflicting with each other and ultimately being so much closing the door after the horse is bolted. It seems to me that the kind of resources that we put into punishment could be far better applied to fixing the systemic problems which create the need for the crimes in the first place. It's entirely possible that we might identify certain classes of crimes that just can't be curtailed in any useful way, but I would like to think that the vast majority of them we will be able to find more reasonable solutions for than just waiting for something to go wrong and then complaining about it. But that's just one of those things that I'm probably wrong about. And it felt pretty rough as I was coming up with it, so I'm sure that down in the comments you can tell me all about why I'm very wrong about this, and some of the rest of you can tell me why I'm right, and can push my argument even further forwards. So I'll leave you to that, and in the meantime, I'll go come up with some more videos, shall I?